Starr, good morning. Welcome. Always good to see you.
Always good to see you too, Walter.
And just for transparency for everybody, it's 2 days till Christmas, and Starr very generously gave up her time this morning to do her author interview. She did a fantastic piece in our first legacy issue on assessment, which of course is where she made her bones, and we were honored to have her share her expertise with our readers. How are you? How's life?
I'm good. It's good. I am also kind of enjoying this quiet week. I have a lot of things to do. I have to like revise my state website and start doing some things that I don't necessarily always have time to do. So I am looking forward to just getting some of the paperwork done in a quieter, not jumping from meeting to meeting kind of environment.
A different kind of busy, and I've always
Yeah,
known you to be busy, so very appropriate. Yes.
it's good.
So, what are you doing these days? You've got your hands in a lot of different projects. Your influence is everywhere. What's exciting you these days? What are you into? What are you looking forward to in the new year?
So I would say that what I'm currently doing is I'm working as a Massachusetts state coordinator for Educators Rising, which
Yes,
is a program that's all about getting passionate young people into the education profession, and who can't be excited about something like that
yes,
in these sort of local grow your own situations. So I have the opportunity to work with different schools who are building education pathways as a part of their CTE programs, and
yes.
helping kids network with each other in the state so that they have their own community as they come up through the state system. And I have been learning a lot about Massachusetts recently and their education system, which they do a lot of things really amazing. They recently passed free community college for all students, which is
Wow.
pretty amazing. And then there are all kinds of scholarships where you could, like, if you stay in a public institution, you could automatically transfer into the UMass program if you
Yeah,
maintain a 2.5 or higher from community college. And then they have scholarships for those folks going into education to support them through that shift, whether they go into a public institution or a private one.
yeah.
So it's just been a lot of new learning being in such a wildly different space. And still in my other spaces as well, like I'm still working on assessment work with the districts that I work in,
Yeah.
and I'm writing for the Captain on a regular basis in my column Career Confidential. So it's cool.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, as you know, Massachusetts is my home state, and they're lucky to have you. Captain is lucky to have you. Your continued work with those school districts, they're lucky to have you. And then you also did some work over the summer, and the Star and I are always talking, so I'm just pulling things out from past conversations, where you're actually advocating for a student out in Colorado who had special needs, and the parents said, "Please come and help us and be our advocate." I mean, that's just wonderful work.
And that work has actually been life-giving. He's actually in Jersey. I was in
Oh,
Colorado
I'm
last
sorry.
year.
I
Oh,
got
no,
my
it's
stories
fine.
mixed up. Keep
Yeah, it's
going.
all
Keep
good.
going.
But first I was completely flattered that they like found me. Like his
Yeah.
his child had some pretty unique challenges,
Yeah.
and I had I was found through higher ed, actually, people who sent him to me as somebody that they considered having the knowledge of alternative assessment expertise and how
Yeah.
best to support his school with supporting him. And I found a lot of joy doing that work, and I get to work with the student who is absolutely amazing and such a thoughtful young man. And I think that in my next life, I could see
Yes.
myself doing this more regularly. So if other families out there are struggling to find someone who really understands the education system and has some very particular assessment needs, it would be my pleasure to help. So you should reach out.
It's got to be a wonderful experience to sit on the other side of the table and sit with a student and his family and talk with the district about how to think about meeting the needs of students. Were there particular insights you walked away with that you didn't have before?
Still, I mean, I would say that what the irony is that the district itself is not unlike the one I grew up in
Hmm.
like affluent Long Island.
Yes.
And it's always amazing to me how affluent communities in particular are so resistant to change because they've not really experienced the need for it. Like they have kids who have resources who can always be successful and get into college and do all these things because their parents have means as well. And
Yes.
so the necessity to innovate isn't as great as it is in some more urban areas where your kiddos have much more diverse needs and therefore and their parents don't have the resources to address those particular needs. So it's been a bizarre homecoming on some level where I get to
Yeah.
remember being a child in that environment myself.
Yeah.
And also a little, it is definitely a little mind-blowing to me just how slowly education moves. And I think sometimes I forget that because the circles I run in are very progressive.
Right.
So
Right.
I get to be a part of all the really truly progressive, wonderful things happening because people
Yes.
solicit my help unless they're ready
Yes.
for something like that. So
It's true.
yeah.
It's a real challenge in thinking about the future of education because it is so slow to change. And you're right, when you travel in circles with a lot of innovation going on, or at least a lot of visioning and uh, using your mind to go to places where we don't currently exist. Um, any thoughts about that? As we continue to try to inform that conversation, how do we get education to catch up to a society that isn't where education is? Education is still in a format and in a grasping for words where 20 or 30 years ago, the late industrial age, and yet society has is changed so quickly and is now so information based and so fueled by technology and innovation that we're just not keeping up. In your mind, can you see what that's going to look like someday, or are we just going to be playing catch up the rest of our lives?
Well, sadly, I think that if there isn't mass change that happens, I think it will be catch up, or people will just fall away. And the difference will be that parents will make the decision to homeschool or create other learning environments because they're going to have the right to do all of those things and
Yeah.
the information on how to do those things. I think COVID restructured our understanding of what education can be and the
Yeah.
different modalities it could happen in. And if parents aren't, the local system is no longer the only way to go anymore. And if we think about education as a business, which, maybe some folks do more than others, I think
Yeah.
that they're going to lose a lot of clientele if we don't get with the program.
And I
And
think the business model may shift to where it's not the public space so much as a huge private marketplace that becomes the option here in Virginia, but also everywhere in South Carolina and Florida and Texas. There are major movements to start offering tuition vouchers to parents
yep.
at the expense, coming out of the pot of public education to fund it. And so all those dynamics you're talking to, plus the political realities of changes in the institution.
I was just going to go there.
Please, I mean, it's
Yeah, I
happening.
I think that the next 4 years is going to be very telling about whether or not things are able to change or if we revert back to things that are even more draconian to what we've got going
Yes,
right now. And
yes,
um, I worry. I worry for a lot of I worry for kids with special needs. I worry for kids who identify in any way that isn't biologically comfortable for a
yeah,
conservative audience.
yeah,
I worry when I moved to Florida, I worried for my own ability to work down here.
sure.
Um, and what I will say, which is very hopeful to me though, Walter, is that
Mm.
I did get to go to an event down here with a lot of educators, and
Yes,
I was shocked and pleased to know that these folks have no intention of necessarily just doing like I mean, we'll change language, we'll do what we have to do, but at the end of the day, kids' needs are still being put first.
Of course.
And so that was very heartening because to be honest with you, I wasn't sure, but that was what was actually happening.
Right.
And so it made my heart happy to hear
Yeah.
what some of my local colleagues were saying. And
Yes.
hello, kitty.
Yes.
Um, so I guess I worry. I don't necessarily, I mean, working in Massachusetts, I worry a little less
Yeah.
because they really do have structures in place that,
Yeah.
I mean, they have their own challenges, don't get me wrong, like
Oh yeah.
every state, but,
Yeah.
and the fact that, I work in that state as a part of a grant, a state grant, so,
Yeah.
and that there's money that comes from the federal government too that we need to think about. And
Yeah.
I have a lot of wonderings and I've been working really hard to not catastrophize, do like the whole spinning out of control about what could be or what will be until we start to see what is. That doesn't mean that I'm not aware of potential outcomes that could be, in
No.
my opinion, dangerous. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I'm trying to just stay where as my mom would say, keep my head where my feet are and be present in right now and do everything I can to be a part of a solution instead of just complaining about all the things that aren't going the way that I would hope they would.
You put it very um well, and it reminds me, I did an author interview with PJ Capozzi a few weeks ago. We were in the same conversation, and he said something very similarly, but it struck me as he said it because he's so PJ, he's just so right there. And he said, I can't worry about that until it happens.
Hmm.
Um, but he focused on the opportunities that could come here, that could make things better. And I said to him in the moment, I'm just struck that you have to have the confidence in yourself as a leader. I'm
Hmm.
speaking to PJ, but I'm also now speaking to you, that you can say that you're not already projecting all the worst possible outcomes that haven't even happened yet, because you have enough confidence in yourself that when those things happen, if certain things play out, that you have the wherewithal and the resources, the ability to represent yourself and advocate for children, that you'll deal with it when it happens.
Yep.
And really, as two mavericks sitting here talking on a Monday morning, I'm excited for the opportunities that there could be change because we've spent our whole careers within an institutional framework that is so resistant to change
Yep.
that you wind up making your career about being a maverick because it's just so ridiculous to even dream of change when the bureaucracy is so heavy and so slow.
And I think too, thinking of that, like there needs to be a personal sort of fortitude that you have within yourself, even like as a classroom teacher, if you're gonna break outside of what is traditionally expected, the way I have and the way others have, in terms of doing what you knew in your gut was right for kids,
Yes,
even though you might not have had the data yet to say, I know this is right for kids because of blah, 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 blah.
right.
You have to get the blah, 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 blah before you could get to that sense.
Yes.
So like you have to take the risk in order to find out if your gut was right. And I would say that education is not always a hospitable place for folks who see things differently. And I would say the world isn't always a hospitable place for people who see the world differently. As a kid, even, I definitely marched to my own beat and
Yeah,
didn't necessarily fit well in the community I grew up in.
right.
Not that anybody ever treated me horribly, but I would say that I was definitely, I used to joke, I think the very first poem I ever had published was about feeling like being a star-shaped peg in a round world.
Yes.
And I have always marched to a very different beat. So
Right.
the fact that this is where I ended up in my life is not completely shocking, but
Right.
I want to be able to say at the end of my days that I was the kind of person other young kids could look to, other people could look to as an example of being able to trust who you are and what you feel on the inside and doing what's right, regardless of the surrounding environment. And that's hard. It's hard to have a target on your back. It's hard to be disliked by people for what you believe.
Yeah.
And, it's not even necessarily personal all the time, but you do
No.
end up being on the receiving end of some pretty ugly stuff. And I'd be
Yeah.
lying if I said if it didn't hurt
Of
to be on the
course.
receiving end of those kinds of things.
Of course. Well, and you are human. For all the
Of course.
superhuman things you exhibit, you are human.
Very.
You're making me think back, I want to say like 2012, 2014, and a slew of governors had come into office around the country who very quickly started addressing education at the state level, fighting with the unions, going after contracts and benefits.
Yep.
Um, and there was a lot of talk, especially on Twitter at the time, among educators, with a few lead voices who were really advocating, standing up, and speaking out about defending the profession.
Yep.
Well, there was one colleague who, I think he was from Pennsylvania, who got very quiet, and we started having side conversations. And I eventually said to him, "Why aren't you speaking out? Why aren't you standing up and saying these things?" And he said to me very confidentially, "I'm afraid.
Mm.
I'm really afraid. I need my job. I have a family." And I've never forgotten that because, and now in this moment especially,
Yep.
this is what certain forces, for lack of a better word, count on, is that educators move like sheep and want to stay in their lane and do not speak up. And we're going to need to speak up. We are going to need to, if nothing else, for children, but then of course for job conditions and salaries and all the things that make schools run. And a voice like yours is so critical because people find courage when they hear you speak up. And I think we're going to need more of it from everyone, starting in 2025, because I don't know that these forces are malicious, but certainly in terms of what's best for kids, they may be misguided. And
Misguided's a really nice way of putting it.
yeah, they just have to hear the rest of the story. Because if we do take all the funding and law around special education and just open it up and not have requirements, certainly it's going to open lanes of innovation, but what it's going to do to kids who count on that money and districts that count on those programs to meet the needs of their students will be catastrophic.
Well,
And
I mean,
so,
it started like I said before, I didn't want to worry about like these big picture horrific things, but there's definitely terminology that's been thrown around during this whole political race that
yeah,
is triggering as a Jewish person in this world.
yeah,
There are some very triggering things that are happening, and um, I'm not going to say that I've been the most vocal person about being Jewish. Not that I'm not
right.
proud to be Jewish, but I have some friends who are very vocal about the anti-Semitic things that are happening in the world right now and
Yeah,
trying to be aware of that and to lend my voice to those folks as well.
right.
And also when we think about the folks who could be most burdened by the changes that could happen now are already our marginalized folks who are in situations that they
Yes,
have fought for such a long time to get any ground with, which is still not anywhere near like equal
right,
any grounds. And I mean, when people look at me, they don't see my Judaism, so
right.
I have the privilege of looking a certain way that other people don't have. Which is also another reason why I feel so called to be a voice because
Yes,
I at this point in my career, 25 or so years in, I feel
yeah,
like I have an obligation to use my experience and my platform to make sure that people who need a voice have a space to share it. And that's why the assessment work that I do is so important because,
Yeah.
when people think about assessment, those that aren't in the know, they think about tests and grades, but assessment is really at the heart of all learning that we do in classes. And
Yep.
if we shift our assessment philosophy, the way we conduct our classrooms, then we're already democratizing a lot of things that have been traditionally hierarchical. And if kids know and see their own power and are given the opportunity to cultivate a story that works for them and
Yeah.
have a learning playground, so to speak, where their educators don't feel afraid to let them harness that voice, then I think we'll get through the next 4 years and then all the years that come thereafter, as long as people feel like what they say matters. And, you know,
Amen. Amen. And in the end, we're all on the same team. We're all in this for the same
yes,
thing.
yes.
So I think someone like yourself who has a voice that brings people together and brings to attention things that we can all rally around. Um, we all have your back. We cheer you on. And but we also look to you and count on you, and we love you because you do speak with authenticity and with kind of, I know this is kind of pejorative, but a moral authority. You've done the work, you've been in the trenches, and you're speaking for kids, and that's so important.
It is, and it's hard, and to be honest with you, Walter, part of my fear of always when I left the classroom, part of my fear was that I'd grow irrelevant the
Right.
further I got from that space, which is why
Yeah.
at this point, being able to work as a student advocate, being able to work with teacher teams, being able to still have a foot near a classroom, maybe not in
Yes.
it, but still be able to hear really listen to educators talking to each other about what their day-to-day struggles are
Yeah.
um and and what they want to do for the kiddos that sit in front of them and the struggles they have to do those things.
Yeah.
It keeps me wanting to seek out situations where I have an opportunity to help them do what they need to do. And 10 years, I guess I left the classroom in 2000 at the end of maybe early 2000, I guess 2017 is when I went into my leadership role.
Right.
So I would say at that point, as things started to shift, it's been a while, and I was convinced that probably up until about a year ago that I would get back into a classroom somehow, and maybe
Right.
the higher ed classroom is something I might end up in at some point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I think working in a high school, unless the absolute right opportunity came, like one
Yeah.
of those innovative schools that specifically don't even function on like a typical day where kids are really able to do what they need to do to be successful.
Yeah.
I couldn't go back to a traditional school now in a leadership
No.
or teaching capacity, even if I wanted to.
No. And I
Um,
think that insight and self-awareness is key. It helps you drive to keep moving forward. I mean,
yeah.
you're a trailblazer. You're not just putting in time in anything you do. So
Well, I mean, there's this much heartbreak in
I know.
thinking about that though, because it was such a heart-wrenching decision to leave when I did.
Yeah.
And I did it with the personal promise to myself that if the opportunity go back where to what I loved most came about,
Yeah.
I I wouldn't I wouldn't run away from it. But
Right.
that was also prior to COVID, and that was also prior to 110 other things that have happened since then. And with every learning experience, you kind of get this opportunity to reevaluate where you are and where you want to be and
Yeah.
what your role in that capacity is as you move forward. So try to surround
Well,
myself with good people like you who keep me grounded and also aren't afraid to say to me, hey, have you really thought about what you're doing
yeah,
right now? And,
right.
you
Right.
know, I need that same kind of check as everybody else. Sometimes when I'm trying to make decisions, I have blind spots and
We all
sometimes I
do.
step in it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
in my way around. It's never intentional, but it doesn't mean it hurts any less or but I don't,
No.
there's just a lot of reflection that goes in there. And I try to remember that too as I'm on my own personal journey to understand whatever implicit biases that I
Yeah.
wrap my brain around and keep
Yeah.
the right people around to kind of be a model for who I want to be and continue to grow into.
And life has a funny way of doing that to us, that
Oh,
the
it does.
things we taught years ago, we never would have even anticipated where we wind up today. And so it's amazing to, even if we did make promises to ourselves, and they mean a lot. I mean, there's a reason why you promised yourself if you have the chance to go back. But, life has a way of showing you new paths, and the impact you've had since you left the district, amazing. I mean, there's no way to even quantify the impact, the ripples that have gone out from the work you've done. Um, Let me ask this before we wrap up, because you're such a prolific writer
Mhm.
and you've got a lot of irons in the fire there. Talk to us about some exciting writing that's coming out in 2025 or book projects ahead.
Sure. So I was very fortunate to work with some of my fellow co-ed champs
Yes.
to write the Everything Guide, which is what we call it internally. And it
Yeah.
was me, Alex, Tiffany, and Marianne. And
Yes.
um, what I'm most proud of in that experience is thinking about how first, we identified common challenges that every school is experiencing now, but instead of living in the problem, we really tried to make the book about the solutions
Yes.
and trying to put it in a place where so many folks will have the opportunity to read about how other people have solved these problems. So it's not like us just giving our expertise about how these problems have been solved. We've actually found people who have had success solving them, and we get this amazing opportunity to share the story and the solutions of so many people around the country and the world.
Yes.
And I think that's what makes the project unique is that there are so many unique voices being celebrated for
Yeah.
the successes they've found.
Yes.
I'm also working on another, I always say it's going to be my last assessment book
Oh, please.
because sometimes I feel like there really isn't that much more to say and
Right.
things change. But me and
Right.
Michael McDowell and Alex are
Yeah.
working to create this assessment playbook, which is sort of like a in the moment moves where teachers know how to collect data. I think we don't give them enough credit in that regard. I think where
Yeah.
they really struggle is what to do with the data once they get it and how quickly they could pivot to see the data and make the shift so that kids are getting the most of what they need. So
Yeah.
that's a project like that one, the draft is due at the towards the fall, so that one will probably come out in 2026. But
Yeah. Yeah.
it's something I'm working on. And then what else am I doing? And I have my column, and that's like a regular
Right.
thing. And maybe we have our podcast too. Crystal Frommer and
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
the Learner-Centered Spaces podcast, which is
Right.
goodness, excuse me, which is all about just different perspectives on how we create truly, one sec,
Yeah.
um, truly robust, authentic spaces for learning.
Yeah.
And so if you're a person who feels like they would be a good person to talk about how their role supports that kind of learning, because we don't just do we've had everyone on the spectrum in terms of like consultants, classroom teachers, elementary, high school, college, professors, leaders, superintendents. We've had
Mhm.
a lot of different people sharing their ideas about how you create those kinds of cultures, which has been
Yes.
amazing. And, who knows where the next project will kind of fall into place too. So I'm excited to be able to know such amazing, innovative folks. And
Yes.
the next major project is always this close when you're around that many really impressive people. So I feel pretty grateful about that. Yourself included, Walter. I mean,
Well, thank you.
can't believe how the Worthy Educator has blossomed really in the
Yeah.
last.
6 months. Yeah.
Has it only been 6
It's
months?
been 6 months. So, and well, you're an innovation magnet, Star. We're all attracted to you, and you bring us together, and that's where all this energy and these ideas come from. So good things ahead, I'm sure, in
Oh,
the new year.
I appreciate that. And I just say, we need each other. I think education is a people
Yes.
profession, and instead of siloing ourselves as traditional education kind of makes us
Yeah.
think is the right way to do, we need to take down all those walls and see each other as colleagues and collaborators, and kind of we innovate best when we're not competing with each other, but we're working together to do what's best. So,
Well said.
yeah.
That's talk about ending on a high note. There you go, right there. That's fantastic. Star, thank you so much.
Thanks, Walter. Always.